The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Clarence House as Officer Michael Hartley adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what he assumed would be another routine day. He had served in the Royal Guard for 7 years, and the position had become almost mechanical in its predictability. Stand at attention, maintain protocol, protect the royal family, and above all, remain invisible. That particular Tuesday in late September seemed no different from any other until the clock struck 10:30. Michael had been assigned to the East Corridor, a quiet section of the residence that overlooked the private gardens. It was considered one of the easier posts, rarely seeing much foot traffic beyond the occasional staff member hurrying to complete their duties. The hallway was lined with portraits of past royals, their painted eyes seeming to follow anyone who walked beneath them. The thick Persian runner muffled footsteps, and the heavy curtains kept the space in a state of permanent twilight. Even on the brightest days, he had been standing at his post for nearly 2 hours when he heard the distinctive click of heels approaching from the south entrance. Queen Consort Camila appeared around the corner, moving with purpose, but without her usual entourage. This was unusual. Royal family members rarely walked the halls alone, especially not in the middle of the morning when schedules were tightly packed with appointments and official duties. Michael snapped to attention, his eyes fixed straight ahead as protocol demanded. But his peripheral vision caught the tension in her shoulders and the tight line of her mouth. Camila glanced at him briefly, seeming to calculate something in her mind before continuing down the corridor. She stopped at a small sitting room about 20 feet from where Michael stood, a room typically used for informal meetings or private phone calls. The door was left slightly ajar, which was the first red flag. In all his years of service, Michael had learned that when royals wanted privacy, doors were firmly closed and staff were dismissed. An open door suggested either carelessness or perhaps something else entirely. Approximately 10 minutes passed in silence. Michael remained motionless, trained to ignore discomfort and fatigue. Then he heard another set of footsteps, these heavier and quicker. A man appeared. Younger than Camila, but bearing a striking resemblance in the set of his jaw and the way he carried himself. Michael recognized him immediately as Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son from her first marriage. Tom was not a regular presence at Clarence House, making his appearance all the more noteworthy. Tom looked agitated as he approached the sitting room. His usually neat hair appeared disheveled, as though he had been running his hands through it repeatedly. He wore casual clothes, jeans, and a button-down shirt, suggesting this was not an official visit. He paused just before entering the room, his hand resting on the doorframe, and looked back down the corridor. His eyes met Michael's for a fraction of a second, and in that brief moment, Michael saw something he had never witnessed in any royal or their family members before: genuine fear. The door closed with a soft click, but the latch did not fully catch. The gap was perhaps an inch wide, hardly noticeable to anyone not paying close attention. Michael found himself in an uncomfortable position. His training dictated that he should maintain his post and ignore whatever transpired behind closed doors. The privacy of the royal family was sacrosanct, protected by tradition, protocol, and the Official Secrets Act. To eavesdrop, even accidentally, was a dismissible offense at minimum and potentially a criminal matter. But the door was open, and sound carried in the old building's corridors. Within moments, voices began to filter through the gap, low and urgent. Michael tried to focus his attention elsewhere, to think about anything other than what he might overhear, but the intensity of the conversation made it impossible to ignore. Camilla's voice rose first, sharp with an emotion he could not immediately identify. The words came in fragments at first, disconnected pieces of a conversation that seemed to be already in progress. Tom's voice was defensive, explaining something about documents and signatures. Camila interrupted him repeatedly, her usual composed demeanor apparently abandoned. Michael felt his heart rate increase. Every instinct told him to move, to walk to the other end of the corridor, or request a rotation to a different post. But moving without orders would draw attention to himself and might create suspicion about what he had heard. Then Camila said something that made Michael's blood run cold. The words were clear and unmistakable, spoken in a moment when her voice rose above the careful whisper they had been maintaining. She mentioned a name someone Michael had heard before in hushed conversations among long-serving palace staff. It was a name that should never be spoken aloud, connected to an incident from decades past that had supposedly been resolved and forgotten. Tom's response was immediate and panicked. He spoke rapidly, words tumbling over each other in his haste to explain or perhaps to warn. Michael caught phrases about journalists, about someone asking questions, about a file that had supposedly been destroyed years ago. The conversation took on a desperate quality, with both voices overlapping as they tried to solve a problem that seemed to grow larger with each passing second. Michael's position became increasingly untenable. He was too far from the door to leave without his footsteps being heard, yet remaining felt like a violation of everything his position represented. Sweat began to form under his collar despite the cool temperature of the corridor. His hands, held rigidly at his sides, trembled almost imperceptibly. 7 years of training Ward with basic human curiosity and a growing sense that he was hearing something significant. Something that extended beyond family drama into territory that might affect more than just those in that room. The conversation shifted again. It's time to matters more concrete. Financial arrangements were discussed, amounts that made Michael's modest salary seem laughable. Tom mentioned accounts and locations that Michael had only heard about in movies. Places where wealthy people supposedly hid money from tax authorities. Camilla's responses grew shorter, more clipped, as though she was making decisions in real time. Then came the moment that changed everything. Tom asked a direct question, his voice clear despite the closed door. He asked his mother if she had told anyone else about this situation, if anyone in the family knew what they were discussing. There was a long pause, the silence stretching so thin that Michael could hear his own breathing. When Camila finally answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. But Michael heard her response with perfect clarity. She said no. No one else knew. No one could know. And then she said something else. Something about making sure it stayed that way, about taking steps that were necessary even if they were unpleasant. Tom protested, his voice rising. But Camila cut him off with an authority that reminded Michael of who exactly he was dealing with. This was not just a concerned mother, but a woman who had navigated the treacherous waters of royal life for decades and had emerged as queen consort. Michael's mind raced. He thought about his duty, his oath, the confidentiality agreements he had signed. He thought about his career, his pension, the life he had built on the foundation of loyal service. But he also thought about what he had just heard. About the implications of a conversation that touched on hidden money, destroyed documents, and secrets that apparently went back decades. The sitting room door suddenly opened wider, and Michael's entire body tensed. Tom emerged first, his face pale and drawn. He walked quickly toward the exit without acknowledging Michael's presence, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Camila followed a moment later, but she paused. She turned to look directly at Michael, her eyes searching his face for any sign that he had heard something he should not have. Michael maintained his neutral expression, the same blank look he had perfected over years of service. But inside, his heart hammered against his ribs. Camila took 3 steps toward him, close enough that he could smell her perfume, an expensive scent that probably cost more than his monthly salary. She studied him for what felt like an eternity, but was likely only 10 seconds. Then she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of unspoken threats and promises. She asked him how long he had been at his post. Michael responded with the exact time, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. She nodded slowly, thanked him for his service, and walked away, her heels clicking against the marble floor with measured precision. Michael remained at his post for the rest of his shift, his mind churning through everything he had heard. When his replacement arrived at 3 o'clock, he completed the standard handover procedure and walked to the guard's changing room in a daze. As he removed his uniform and hung it carefully in his locker, he caught his reflection in the mirror. He looked the same as he had that morning, but he felt fundamentally changed. He had stumbled onto something, and the question that haunted him as he left Clarence's house that evening was simple but terrifying. What was he going to do about it? Michael Hartley did not sleep that night. He lay in his modest flat in South London, staring at the ceiling while traffic noise filtered through the windows. His mind replayed the conversation he had overheard, analyzing each word, each tone, trying to understand the full picture of what he had stumbled upon. By the time dawn broke, he had convinced himself that he had two choices: forget everything he heard and continue with his life as planned, or investigate further and risk everything he had built. The following morning, Michael reported for duty with dark circles under his eyes. He had been reassigned to the main entrance, a public-facing position that required interaction with visitors and tourists. It was a standard rotation, nothing unusual. But Michael could not shake the feeling that he was being watched more carefully than before. Other guards seemed to glance at him more frequently, and senior officers asked questions about his previous day's shift with what felt like excessive interest. During his lunch break, Michael sat alone in the staff canteen, picking at a sandwich he had no appetite for. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief and unsettling. "We should talk about what you heard yesterday. Coffee shop on Marylebone High Street at 7 tonight. Come alone." There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it, but Michael felt his stomach drop. Someone knew that he had been listening, and that someone wanted to meet. The afternoon dragged by in slow motion. Michael performed his duties automatically, his mind elsewhere. He considered ignoring the message, blocking the number, and pretending nothing had happened. But curiosity, and a growing sense that he was already involved, whether he liked it or not, pushed him toward keeping the appointment. At 6:30, he left Clarence House in civilian clothes and took the underground to Marylebone, his eyes constantly scanning for anyone who might be following him. The coffee shop was a small establishment tucked between a bookstore and a dry cleaner, the kind of place that catered to locals rather than tourists. Michael arrived 15 minutes early and chose a table in the back corner with a clear view of the entrance. He ordered a black coffee he did not drink and waited, his leg bouncing nervously under the table. At precisely 7 o'clock, a woman in her mid-50s entered the shop, looked directly at him, and walked over without hesitation. She introduced herself as Margaret Thornberry, and the name meant nothing to Michael until she explained that she had worked at Buckingham Palace for 23 years before retiring 5 years ago. She had been a private secretary to various members of the royal household. She claimed to have information that would help Michael understand what he had overheard. Margaret ordered tea, sat down with the careful movements of someone who had spent a lifetime being cautious. Margaret began to speak in a low voice that forced Michael to lean forward to hear her clearly. She told him that she had been expecting something like this to happen, that certain secrets within the royal family were bound to surface eventually, despite everyone's best efforts to keep them buried. She explained that she had been monitoring staff assignments at Clarence House through contacts she still maintained. And when she heard that Michael had been posted to the East Corridor on the same day that Tom Parker Bowles visited, she knew there was a possibility that the conversation would be overheard. Michael asked the obvious question: how did she know there would be a conversation worth overhearing? Margaret smiled sadly and explained that she had been one of the people who helped arrange the cover-up decades ago. When the incident first occurred, she had been young then, ambitious, and willing to follow orders without asking too many questions. But retirement had given her time to reflect, and she had come to believe that some secrets did more harm, staying hidden than they would if exposed. The story Margaret told was complex and sprawling. Reaching back to the early 1980s, it involved Tom Parker Bowles' father, Andrew Parker Bowles, a financial scheme that had been designed to move money out of certain royal accounts and into private investments. The scheme had been technically legal but morally questionable, and it had been facilitated by people who believed they were protecting the monarchy from potential embarrassment. Camila had known about it, had perhaps even benefited from it, though Margaret insisted that Camilla's involvement had been minimal at the time. The problem, Margaret explained, was that records existed. Documents had been created, signatures had been collected, and despite assurances that everything had been destroyed, at least one complete file had survived. That file had recently been discovered by a journalist who specialized in royal finances, someone with a reputation for meticulous research and an unwillingness to be intimidated by powerful people. The journalist had reached out to Tom Parker Bowles for comment, which had triggered the panicked meeting Michael had accidentally overheard. Michael listened with growing disbelief. The conversation he had heard suddenly made sense in a much darker context. The mentions of destroyed files, the references to journalists, the discussion of financial arrangements in foreign accounts, all of it fit together into a picture of a family desperately trying to prevent an old scandal from resurfacing at the worst possible time. With Camila newly installed as queen consort and the monarchy facing increasing scrutiny about finances and privilege, a revelation about financial impropriety, even decades-old impropriety, could be devastating. Margaret pulled out a thin folder from her bag and slid it across the table. Inside were photocopies of documents, bank statements, and what appeared to be internal memos from the early 80s. She had kept copies as insurance, she explained, though she had never intended to use them. But after learning that Michael might have overheard the conversation, she decided it was time to share them with someone who could make a decision about what to do next. She was too old and too tired to fight this battle herself, but Michael was young enough and positioned correctly to make a difference if he chose to. Michael stared at the folder as though it contained a venomous snake. Taking it would make him complicit in whatever came next. It would transform him from an accidental eavesdropper into an active participant in a potential scandal. But leaving it on the table felt like a betrayal of some principle he could not quite name. A sense that truth mattered even when it was inconvenient or dangerous. After a long moment, he reached out and pulled the folder toward himself. Tucking it into his jacket with hands that shook slightly, Margaret nodded approval and stood to leave. Before she walked away, she offered one final piece of advice. Trust no one within the palace system, document everything. And be prepared for the possibility that powerful people would try to discredit or silence him if he chose to pursue this matter. She gave him a phone number where she could be reached if he needed guidance, then disappeared into the evening crowd on Marylebone High Street. Leaving Michael alone with a folder full of explosive secrets, Michael returned to his flat and spread the documents across his small dining table. He spent hours examining them, trying to understand the financial transactions and legal language. Some of it was beyond his expertise, but enough was clear to confirm that Margaret's story was accurate. Money had been moved, records had been falsified, and people in positions of authority had looked the other way or actively participated in covering up the transactions. The next several days passed in a blur of routine duties and secret research. Michael began to understand the full scope of what he had stumbled into. The original financial scheme had been relatively minor in terms of the amounts involved, perhaps a few £100,000, but it had established patterns of behavior that apparently continued for years afterward. More troubling were the implications about who had known what and when. Several members of the royal family, including some still alive and active, had apparently been aware of the irregularities, but had chosen to remain silent. Michael also discovered that Tom Parker Bowles's panic was justified. The journalist Margaret had mentioned, a man named David Brennan, published several previous investigations into royal finances that had been both accurate and damaging. He was currently working for a major newspaper known for its willingness to take on powerful institutions. If Brennan had indeed obtained documents related to this old scheme, and if he was asking Tom Parker Bowles for comment, publication was likely imminent. Michael faced a decision that kept him awake night after night. He could turn the documents over to a journalist himself, perhaps even Brennan, and potentially trigger a major scandal. He could take them to palace officials and hope that bringing everything into the open would force an honest reckoning. He could destroy them and pretend he had never seen them, protecting both himself and the institution he served. Or he could do nothing and wait to see how events unfolded, keeping the documents as insurance against potential retaliation. Each option carried enormous risks. Going public would almost certainly cost him his career and possibly expose him to legal action. The palace could argue that he had stolen confidential documents or violated his security clearance. Going to palace officials might seem like the right thing to do. But Michael had learned enough about institutional protection to know that whistleblowers within the system were rarely treated well. Destroying the documents felt like cowardice, but it was undeniably the safest personal choice. As Michael wrestled with his conscience, he noticed changes in his work environment. His shifts were being scheduled differently, keeping him away from areas where royals congregated. Senior officers asked casual questions about his personal life, his financial situation, his plans for the future. The questions felt like probing, attempts to find leverage or weakness. One evening, he returned to his flat to find subtle signs that someone had been inside. Books on shelves moved slightly, drawers not quite closed completely. Nothing was missing, but the message was clear. He was being watched. Michael made copies of the documents and hid them in multiple locations. A storage locker, a friend's house, a bank safety deposit box. He wrote detailed accounts of everything he had heard and learned, dating and signing each entry. He was building a record, creating protection through documentation, though he was not entirely sure what he was protecting himself against. The paranoia felt justified when he received a second anonymous text message, this one less friendly than the first. It simply said, "Be smart. Some stones are better left unturned." The pressure mounted as days turned into weeks. Michael lost weight, stopped socializing with colleagues, and found himself jumping at unexpected sounds. His commanding officer called him in for a wellness check, expressing concern about his recent behavior. Michael assured him that everything was fine, just some personal stress, nothing that affected his work. The officer seemed unconvinced, but did not push further. Though Michael noticed that his security clearance was being reviewed, a process that usually happened only when someone was being considered for a sensitive position or when questions had been raised about their reliability. Then, on a cold October morning, the situation reached a breaking point. Michael was called to a meeting with senior palace security officials, men he had never spoken to directly before. They sat him down in a windowless office and asked him directly about the conversation he had overheard between Camila and her son. They had clearly decided that subtlety was no longer working and that direct confrontation was necessary. Michael's moment of truth had arrived. Whatever he said in the next few minutes would determine the course of everything that followed. The security office felt smaller than it actually was. With 3 men in dark suits sitting across from Michael at a plain wooden table, the lead official, a man named Colonel Richard Stanhope, had a military bearing and eyes that revealed nothing. He opened a file folder that Michael suspected contained his entire employment history, possibly more. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and somewhere in the building a clock chimed 10 times, marking the official start of what Michael knew would be the most important conversation of his life. Colonel Stanhope began with pleasantries, asking about Michael's service record and expressing appreciation for his years of dedication. But the tone shifted quickly, becoming sharper and more focused. The colonel asked Michael to recall his duties on the day in question, specifically his posting in the East Corridor. Michael answered truthfully, providing times and routine details. Then came the critical question. Delivered in a casual tone that did not match its importance, had Michael heard anything unusual during his shift? Any conversations or discussions that seemed out of the ordinary? Michael had spent weeks preparing for this moment, rehearsing possible responses, weighing honesty against self-preservation. In that instant, sitting across from men who wielded enormous power within the palace system, made a choice that surprised even himself. He told them the truth. He explained that he had been stationed near a sitting room, that the door had been improperly latched, and that he had inadvertently overheard portions of a conversation between the queen consort and her son. He emphasized the word inadvertently, making it clear that he had not sought out the information. The 3 officials exchanged glances. Colonel Stanhope leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He asked Michael what exactly he had heard, and Michael provided a carefully edited version of the conversation. He mentioned that there had been discussion of documents and journalists, that both parties had seemed concerned about something from the past, but he deliberately left out the specific details about financial schemes and the names that had been mentioned. He was walking a tightrope, being honest enough to seem credible while holding back enough to maintain some leverage. The colonel listened without interruption, taking notes on a legal pad with a fountain pen. When Michael finished, there was a long silence. Finally, Stanhope asked the question that Michael had been dreading. Had Michael discussed what he heard with anyone else? Had he made any recordings or written any notes about the conversation? Michael lied smoothly, saying no. He had not spoken to anyone and had not documented anything. He understood that such actions would violate his security clearance and his oath of service. Another official, younger than Stanhope and wearing wire-rimmed glasses, spoke for the first time. He asked Michael if he understood the sensitivity of his position, if he grasped how easily misunderstood conversations could be taken out of context and used to harm the institution they all served. Michael nodded, playing the role of the loyal soldier who recognized the bigger picture. The official continued, explaining that royal family members often discussed matters that might sound concerning to outsiders, but were actually innocent when properly understood. He suggested that Michael had likely heard a conversation about old charity finances, or perhaps a discussion of historical records. Nothing more sinister than that. Colonel Stanhope took control of the conversation again. He explained that the palace had a problem, and that problem was the potential for misunderstanding and rumor. Even though Michael had clearly heard nothing of importance, the mere fact that he had been in a position to overhear a private conversation created a vulnerability. The colonel asked Michael what he thought should be done to address this situation. Michael recognized this as a test, a way to gauge his loyalty and his willingness to cooperate. Michael suggested that he could be reassigned to positions where such incidents would be less likely to occur. Perhaps outdoor duties or rotations that did not place him near private areas of the residences. Colonel Stanhope smiled for the first time, a cold expression that did not reach his eyes. He said that reassignment was certainly one option, but there might be others that would benefit everyone involved. He produced a document from his folder and slid it across the table. The document was a non-disclosure agreement, far more detailed and restrictive than anything Michael had signed when he first joined the Royal Guard. This new agreement specifically addressed the conversation he had overheard, requiring him to never discuss it with anyone under any circumstances. It included severe financial penalties for breaches and made clear that violations would be pursued through both civil and criminal channels. Michael read through it carefully, noting that the language was so broad, it would essentially prevent him from ever speaking about his time at Clarence House in any meaningful way. Stanhope gave Michael time to read, watching him closely. When Michael looked up, the colonel explained that signing the agreement would resolve the matter completely. Michael would continue in his role with no negative consequences, though he would be reassigned, as he had suggested, to positions with less access to private areas. There would be a compensation package, the colonel added, a bonus payment that recognized Michael's discretion and professionalism. The amount mentioned was substantial, enough to make a real difference in Michael's life. Michael asked for time to consider the agreement, perhaps to have a solicitor review it. Colonel Stanhope's expression hardened. He explained that time was not a luxury available in this situation. The agreement needed to be signed immediately, that very day, or the palace would have no choice but to terminate Michael's employment based on security concerns. His clearance would be revoked, his pension would be jeopardized, his prospects for future security-related employment would be effectively destroyed. The message was clear. Sign now on the palace's terms, or face professional ruin. Michael felt anger rising in his chest, the heat of it spreading to his face. 7 years of loyal service had brought him to this moment, being threatened and bribed in equal measure. He thought about the documents hidden in his flat, about Margaret Thornberry's warning to trust no one within the system. He thought about the journalist David Brennan and whether exposing everything might be the only way to protect himself from being made a scapegoat if the story eventually broke through other channels. But Michael also thought about his mother, who depended on the money he sent her each month. He thought about his own future, the career he had worked so hard to build. He thought about the reality that fighting the palace would be a battle he could not win. Not as an individual guard with limited resources against an institution with effectively unlimited power and influence. Idealism warred with pragmatism, and pragmatism was winning. Michael asked about the compensation package, how much and when it would be paid. The younger official provided details. £30,000. Transferred to his account within a week of signing the agreement. It was enough to pay off his debts, to help his mother, to create a small financial cushion. It was also, Michael recognized, an amount carefully calculated to be tempting, but not so large as to seem suspicious or create tax complications that might draw external attention. Stanhope produced a pen and placed it on the table in front of Michael. The symbolism was obvious and heavy-handed, but effective nonetheless. Michael picked up the pen, its weight solid and real in his hand. He looked at the document again, reading key passages one more time. Once he signed this, he would be bound by its terms for the rest of his life. Any attempt to discuss what he had heard would result in financial ruin and likely criminal prosecution. The palace was buying his silence, and they were doing it efficiently and effectively. Michael signed the document. He told himself that he was being practical, that he was protecting himself and his family, that fighting would serve no purpose except to destroy his own life. But as he watched Colonel Stanhope countersign the agreement and place it in his folder, Michael felt a deep sense of shame mixed with relief. He had sold out. There was no other way to describe it, but he had also survived. In that windowless office, survival felt like enough. The meeting concluded with handshakes and assurances of continued employment. Michael was told to take the rest of the day off, to rest and reflect on the importance of discretion and loyalty. His new duty assignments would begin the following week, focusing on perimeter security and public-facing roles. As Michael left the office and walked through the corridors of Clarence's house, toward the exit, he passed the east corridor where everything had started. The sitting room door was closed and would likely remain closed during any future private conversations. Michael went home and stared at the documents he had hidden in his flat. The non-disclosure agreement he had just signed did not mention physical documents, only discussions and disclosures. Technically, keeping the papers was not a violation, though using them certainly would be. He considered destroying them as a final act of compliance, but something stopped him. Instead, he left them hidden, a secret insurance policy against a future he could not predict. Over the following days, Michael tried to settle into his new routine. The £30,000 appeared in his account exactly when promised. He sent money to his mother and paid off his credit cards. He told friends and colleagues that he had received a performance bonus, which was accepted without question. But at night, when sleep would not come, Michael thought about Margaret Thornberry and wondered if she would be disappointed in his choice. He thought about the journalist David Brennan and whether the story would break regardless of Michael's silence. 2 weeks after signing the non-disclosure agreement, Michael read a brief article in a minor newspaper about questions being raised regarding historical royal finances. The article was short and light on details, suggesting that a larger investigation was underway, but that access to relevant documents was proving difficult. Michael recognized this as likely connected to the situation he had overheard. But the article gained little traction and disappeared from public attention within a day or two. Michael convinced himself that he had made the right choice. The scandal, if it could even be called that, seemed to be dying before it truly started. His silence had not prevented justice or enabled wrongdoing because apparently there was no wrongdoing worth exposing, or at least none that could be proven or that the public cared about. He had protected his career, supported his family, and avoided unnecessary drama. This was the mature, responsible decision. But deep in his conscience, in a place Michael tried hard not to examine too closely, he knew that he had compromised something important. He had stood at a crossroads between truth and comfort, between principle and practicality, and he had chosen the path of least resistance. The money in his account felt increasingly like payment for a piece of his integrity, and the comfortable lie he told himself about making the right choice grew thinner with each passing day. Then, on a rainy November evening, exactly 6 weeks after signing the non-disclosure agreement, Michael received a phone call that changed everything once again. The caller identified herself as Rebecca Sutton, and she said she was calling on behalf of David Brennan, the journalist investigating royal finances. She explained that Brennan had spoken with Margaret Thornberry before she died, just 3 days earlier from a sudden heart attack. Margaret had told Brennan about meeting with a royal guard, about providing him with documents, and about hoping he would do the right thing, even though she suspected he would not. Rebecca explained that Brennan was preparing to publish his investigation. Despite obstacles in obtaining official documents, he wanted to speak with Michael, to hear his first-hand account of what he had overheard, and to potentially use the documents Margaret had mentioned. Rebecca made it clear that Michael's cooperation was not required, but that his testimony would make the story more credible and harder for the palace to dismiss. She gave Michael a phone number and asked him to think carefully about what kind of person he wanted to be, what kind of legacy he wanted to leave. Michael sat in his flat after the call ended, staring at the phone in his hand. Margaret was dead, possibly from natural causes, but possibly not. The investigation was moving forward regardless of what he did, and he had a choice to make, this time with fuller knowledge of the consequences and with no one looking over his shoulder. The comfortable path he had chosen 6 weeks earlier had led him to this moment, and now he had to decide if he would continue down that path, or if he would find the courage to turn back. Michael did not sleep at all that night. He sat at his dining table with Margaret's documents spread before him, reading through them again with new eyes. The woman who had given him these papers was dead, and whether her death was natural or something more sinister, it served as a stark reminder of the forces he was dealing with. Margaret had spent decades navigating palace politics, had survived countless intrigues and power struggles, yet in the end, she had died alone, just weeks after deciding to speak out. Michael could not shake the feeling that her timing was not coincidental. The documents told a story of systematic financial manipulation that went far beyond what Michael had initially understood. The early 1980s scheme that Margaret had described was just the beginning. The papers showed a pattern of similar transactions continuing throughout the subsequent decades, involving larger amounts of money and more sophisticated methods of concealment. Trust funds had been established in tax havens. Charitable organizations had been used as conduits for private wealth. And official accounting had been carefully structured to obscure the movement of millions of pounds. What made the documents particularly damaging was not just the financial irregularities, but the evidence of who had known about them and when. Memos bore the initials of senior royal advisors, some of whom had gone on to prominent positions in government and finance. There were references to conversations with family members who had expressed concerns, but had ultimately chosen not to push for transparency. The picture that emerged was one of institutional corruption, not in the sense of illegal activity necessarily, but in the broader sense of an organization that had lost its moral compass in service of self-protection. Michael thought about Camilla's conversation with her son in that context. Tom's panic made perfect sense if he knew that these documents existed and that a journalist was piecing the story together. The discussion of destroyed files and foreign accounts was not about hiding evidence of a single old indiscretion, but about preventing the exposure of a long-term pattern of behavior. And Camilla's determination to keep the matter secret, her willingness to take necessary steps even if unpleasant, suggested that she understood the stakes involved. As dawn broke over London, Michael made his decision. He retrieved the copies of the documents from their various hiding places, assembled them into a complete package, and prepared to contact David Brennan. But first, he needed to protect himself. He wrote a detailed account of everything that had happened, from the moment he overheard the conversation to his meeting with palace security officials to the phone call from Rebecca Sutton. He described the non-disclosure agreement he had signed under duress, the compensation payment that was clearly meant as a bribe, the subtle threats that had been made against his career and livelihood. Michael made multiple copies of his written account and the documents, storing them with different trusted individuals, along with instructions to release everything to the press and to law enforcement. If anything happened to him, it was a crude form of insurance, the kind of thing he had seen in movies but never imagined doing himself. Yet Margaret's death had taught him that when dealing with powerful institutions, paranoia was simply realistic risk assessment. He called the number Rebecca Sutton had provided at 9 o'clock that morning. She answered on the second ring and listened as Michael explained that he was willing to cooperate with Brennan's investigation. He described the documents he possessed and the first-hand testimony he could provide about the conversation he had overheard. Rebecca's response was carefully neutral, neither excited nor dismissive, simply professional. She arranged a meeting for that afternoon at a location outside London, a pub in a small village where they were unlikely to be observed or interrupted. Michael took a personal day from work, citing illness. He gathered the documents, his written account, and his phone with its recording of the threatening text messages he had received. He took a train to the village Rebecca had specified, changing trains twice and checking constantly to ensure he was not being followed. The spycraft felt absurd, like something from a novel. But he had learned that reality could be stranger and more dangerous than fiction when powerful interests were threatened. The pub was exactly the kind of establishment that existed in hundreds of English villages. Low ceilings, dark wood, hunting prints on the walls, a clientele of local regulars who eyed strangers with mild curiosity. David Brennan was sitting in a corner booth, a man in his early 50s with gray hair and the kind of intense focus that marked him as someone who took his work seriously. Rebecca Sutton sat beside him, younger and more casually dressed than her phone manner had suggested. They stood when Michael approached, shook hands, and waited until he was seated before beginning the conversation. Brennan did not waste time on pleasantries. He laid out what he already knew, which turned out to be substantial. He had been investigating royal finances for 18 months, following leads from multiple sources. He had discovered evidence of the financial schemes through careful analysis of public records, charity filings, and leaked documents from various sources. What he lacked was eyewitness testimony and physical evidence that would make the story unassailable. Margaret Thornberry had been prepared to provide an affidavit about her role in facilitating the cover-ups. But her sudden death had eliminated that possibility. Michael produced the documents, and Brennan examined them with the careful attention of someone who understood their significance. He asked detailed questions about their provenance, how Margaret had obtained them, what precautions had been taken to ensure they were authentic, rather than forgeries. Michael answered as best he could, though he acknowledged that he could not personally vouch for every document's authenticity, since Margaret had been the original source. Then Michael recounted the conversation he had overheard, providing as much detail as he could remember. Brennan recorded the conversation with Michael's permission, asking follow-up questions to clarify specific points. When Michael described the subsequent meeting with palace security officials and the non-disclosure agreement, Brennan's expression grew darker. He explained that such agreements, while legally binding, were not absolute protections for organizations trying to conceal wrongdoing. If the matter involved genuine public interest, courts had sometimes voided such agreements or limited their enforcement. Rebecca raised a practical concern. Publishing the story would almost certainly result in the palace taking legal action against the newspaper and potentially against Michael personally. The royal family had extensive legal resources and a track record of aggressive litigation against media organizations. Even if the story was completely accurate, the legal battle could be lengthy and expensive. Michael needed to understand that cooperation would likely mean years of legal fights, public scrutiny, and personal attacks on his character and credibility. Michael had anticipated this, but hearing it stated so bluntly made the reality sink in more deeply. He asked what Brennan thought the outcome would be if the story was published. The journalist leaned back in his seat, considering his response carefully. He said that in his experience, stories about royal finances tended to generate significant public interest, but rarely resulted in major consequences for the family itself. There would be headlines, parliamentary questions, perhaps an internal review, but the institution was remarkably resilient and adept at weathering scandals. However, Brennan continued, that did not mean publication was pointless. Public awareness mattered, accountability mattered, and establishing a historical record mattered, even if immediate consequences were limited. Moreover, one thorough investigation could open doors for future journalists and researchers, making it harder for the palace to maintain secrecy about financial matters. Michael's contribution, if he chose to provide it, would be part of a longer arc toward transparency and accountability. Michael thought about his mother, about the career he would be ending, about the comfortable life he would be sacrificing. He thought about the £30,000 sitting in his bank account, money he had essentially been paid to remain silent. He thought about Margaret Thornberry, who had carried her secrets for decades before finally deciding that truth mattered more than personal security. And he thought about the guard he had been when he first joined the service. It's idealistic and committed to principles that seemed increasingly quaint in the face of institutional reality. He would provide the documents, give an on-the-record interview, testify if legal proceedings resulted from the publication. He understood the risks and accepted them. In return, he asked only that Brennan's newspaper provide legal support. If the palace sued him personally, which Rebecca promised would be arranged. They spent the next 4 hours going through every document, every detail of Michael's account, building a comprehensive record that would support the story Brennan intended to publish. As Michael took the train back to London that evening, he felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. The decision was made, the die was cast, and there was no going back. He would breach the non-disclosure agreement, forfeit the compensation payment, and almost certainly lose his job. He would be portrayed as disloyal, as a man who had violated trust and betrayed the institution that had employed him. But he would also be able to look at himself in the mirror without shame, would be able to tell his mother that he had chosen principle over pragmatism when it truly mattered. The story broke 2 weeks later on a Sunday morning. The newspaper ran it as a front-page feature with the headline "Royal Family's Secret Finances, Decades of Hidden Transactions Exposed." The article was carefully written, heavily footnoted, and devastating in its accumulated detail. It laid out the financial schemes, identified the individuals involved, and included extensive quotes from Michael's interview. His name was published. His photograph appeared alongside the article. His first-hand account of the overheard conversation provided the human element that transformed the story. From an abstract financial investigation into something more immediate and relatable, the palace response was swift and predictable. An official statement denied all wrongdoing, characterized the documents as misleading or taken out of context, and threatened legal action against the newspaper for what it called a malicious and defamatory attack on the royal family. Michael was fired that same day. His security clearance was revoked. Palace sources provided anonymous quotes to friendly journalists, describing him as disgruntled, financially motivated, and unreliable. The media circus that followed was intense. Michael's flat was besieged by reporters. Photographers camped outside his building, and his personal life was investigated and reported in tabloids. Old friends from the Guard gave interviews criticizing him, describing him as someone who had always been ambitious and resentful. The palace's legal team filed suit against both the newspaper and Michael personally, seeking damages and an injunction against further publication of the documents. But something unexpected happened as well. Other former palace employees came forward with their own stories of financial irregularities, cover-ups, and pressure to remain silent. The opposition parties in Parliament demanded a full investigation into royal finances, arguing that the family's exemption from normal transparency requirements could no longer be justified. Public opinion polls showed that a majority of Britons believed the allegations deserved serious investigation rather than dismissal. And even traditionally pro-monarchy newspapers ran editorials calling for greater accountability. The legal battles dragged on for months. Michael testified in multiple proceedings. His credibility was attacked repeatedly. The financial cost of defending himself was enormous, despite the newspaper's legal support. He could not find employment in security or any field that required background checks. He lived off savings and occasional freelance work, struggling to pay bills and support his mother. There were dark days when he questioned whether he had made the right choice, whether principles were worth the price he was paying. The final resolution came more than a year after the original story was published. The palace agreed to an out-of-court settlement that involved no admission of wrongdoing, but included commitments to greater financial transparency going forward. The lawsuit against Michael was dropped as part of the settlement. Though he received no compensation for the damage to his reputation or career, the newspaper declared victory. The palace claimed vindication. And the truth, as often happens, fell somewhere in the middle. Michael moved out of London to a smaller town where no one knew his history. He found work as a security consultant for small businesses. A far cry from his former position, but honest employment nonetheless. He stayed in touch with Rebecca Sutton, who had become something of a friend through the ordeal, and occasionally contributed information to investigative journalists working on stories about institutional accountability. On quiet evenings, Michael sometimes thought about that September morning when he had been standing in the east corridor of Clarence House, thinking it would be just another routine day. He thought about the moment when Camila had studied his face, searching for any sign that he had heard too much. He thought about Margaret Thornberry and the price she had ultimately paid for her decision to speak out. And he thought about the choice he had made, the decision to prioritize truth over comfort, principle over pragmatism. He could not say whether his choice had made a significant difference in the larger scheme of things. The royal family continued. The institution adapted and survived as it always had, and the daily lives of most people remained unchanged. But Michael had learned something important through the experience. Integrity was not about grand gestures or guaranteed victories. It was about making the right choice even when the cost was high, even when success was uncertain, even when powerful forces aligned against you. Michael had been a loyal servant of the crown, a man who took his oaths seriously and believed in duty and service. He had stumbled upon information he was never meant to hear, and that accident had forced him to decide what kind of person he truly was. In the end, he had chosen to be someone who could live with his reflection, someone who valued truth enough to sacrifice comfort, someone who understood that real courage meant standing alone when necessary. The story that had begun with an overheard conversation in a quiet corridor had become something larger than Michael could have imagined. It had exposed him to dangers he had never anticipated, cost him a career he had worked years to build, and tested his character in ways he had never expected. But it had also revealed to him who he really was beneath the uniform and the protocols. And that self-knowledge, painful and expensive as it had been to acquire, was something that could never be taken away. Michael Hartley had been an ordinary man placed in an extraordinary situation, and he had found within himself the strength to do what he believed was right. In the end, that was the only victory that truly mattered.